Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Before the curtain rises on our episode today, please forgive my repeating my usual plug. I'd be grateful if you would consider becoming a patron of the podcast. For the price of a glass of Prosecco at the interval, you can help me to continue to make the podcast. Patrons also enjoy additional content, including the footnotes I publish about the plays we cover, as well as my personal reviews of current productions. For more information about becoming a patron, please visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast. Thank you. And now, on with today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 60 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the exterior of a two-story corner building on a street named Elysian Fields in a poor part of New Orleans. It is a warm evening in May. Voices can be heard from the street, and a tinny piano is playing from the bar around the corner. Neighbors chat on the steps as two young men arrive back from work. One briefly greets his wife on the first floor landing before they both head off to the bowling alley. Another young woman appears around the corner, carrying a suitcase and looking for an address. Her appearance is incongruous to the setting because she is dressed in a white suit with white gloves and hat, looking as if she were arriving at a summer tea or cocktail party. This is the figure of Blanche Dubois, who has arrived in New Orleans seeking sanctuary with her younger sister Stella, who lives here with her husband Stanley, but she does not find the welcome she so desperately hopes for. This is Tennessee Williams' explosive drama of fragile dreams and brutal reality in the Deep South, A Streetcar Named Desire. A Streetcar Named Desire is one of the towering masterpieces of American theater, distinguished for its frank depiction of sexual compulsion, its lyrical language, and its poignant portrait of mental fragility, as well as the bitter clash between two of the greatest dramatic characters, the damaged and defiant Blanche Dubois and the unrestrained masculine power that is Stanley Kowalski. Streetcar, as the play is familiarly known, opened on Broadway in December 1947 with Jessica Tandy as Blanche and a virtual unknown at the time, Marlon Brando, as Stanley. The production won great acclaim and the 1948 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Arthur Miller said that the play planted the flag of beauty on the shores of commercial theater. The first UK production was in October 1949, directed by Laurence Olivier and starring his wife Vivien Leigh as Blanche, who would, of course, go on to reprise the role with Brando in the famous 1951 film. The Broadway box office and the film advance assured Tennessee Williams' fame and fortune. The play has been revived many times on stage and on the small screen, attracting renowned actors to its lead roles. A new production at the Almeida Theatre in London, directed by Rebecca Frecknell, with Patsy Farron as Blanche and Paul Mescal as Stanley, opened to rave reviews at the end of last year, and its transfer to the West End in London this month is already sold out. I'm delighted to be able to devote an episode of the podcast to this giant of a play, and privileged to be joined by an expert on Tennessee Williams, Professor Thomas Keith, who has edited more than 20 of Williams's titles for New Directions Publishing over the past 2 decades. Thomas is also the co-editor of the Letters of Tennessee Williams and James Laughlin, and the editor of Love, Christopher Street, LGBTQ Essays about New York City. Thomas is the resident dramaturge at the Provincetown Tennessee Williams Theater Festival and teaches acting and theater at Pace University in New York, from where he joins me online today. Welcome, Thomas. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Douglas. It's my pleasure.
So my first question is a personal one, Thomas. Given your absorption in the drama of Tennessee Williams, what was your first encounter with his work? And more particularly, where did you first see Streetcar and what impression did it make on you?
Well, my first encounter with Tennessee Williams writing was a one-act called The Case of the Crushed Petunias that I read, I think, as a sophomore in high school. My next encounter, I think, was with The Glass Menagerie in English class. And then, and I don't know how, but somehow or another, all of the kids who were in the drama club, we saw the film of A Streetcar Named Desire, and that became the gold standard for Tennessee Williams and for that play for quite a few years, as Brando and Vivien Leigh, which for a lot of people were those parts of Stanley and Blanche. And then the next time I saw it was in a dinner theater production in Ravenna, Ohio, where the audience turns on a turntable eating while the play goes on. And that did not shake the film version. And then when I was at school, a friend said to me, I have a record album of the 1947 Drama Critics Circle Award, and the actors do scenes from Streetcar. And I listened to that, and that began to change my understanding of the play for the first time. Because as I said, Vivien Leigh had been Blanche as far as I was concerned, and she gave a brilliant performance. However, when I heard Jessica Tandy, she was so different.
Really?
So different. You can search for it on YouTube. I think it's available on YouTube now. Anyway, when she appears in the scenes that they did, she's not shaky. She's not neurotic per se. She's cunning. She's funny. She's a school teacher. And what I learned from that is a common lesson about not playing the end at the beginning. And I think as much as I do love Vivien Leigh in that film, she does kind of play the end at the beginning.
Uh-huh.
She's extremely vulnerable from the get-go, whereas Jessica Tandy had room to grow and to change. And I've seen that with a lot of Blanches, where they begin in one way when they're just arriving in New Orleans, and then the end, of course, is completely different.
That's fascinating. I mean, we will talk about the journey Blanche goes on and how that might be played. But like you, my first encounter was with the film, and I think it was quite a long time before I actually saw it on stage. And even now, it's very hard to supplant the Brando and Vivien Leigh images as defining in my mind somehow. But you're right. Interesting, the Almeida production. We're not going to talk too much about it, but for those who are lucky enough to see it in London, it is an interesting interpretation. And I would say that Patsy Farron plays Blanche as a stronger character, certainly initially, than you would expect. I mean, she's certainly damaged and nervous, but she gives as good as she gets from Stanley, I'd say, in some respects. I cannot imagine, actually, that there are many listeners who are not familiar with the play or the film, but as a rule, I do like to give a brief summary of the plot of our play, if only as a reminder and a way to lead us into the details. So would you be able to give us a very brief synopsis of the play, Thomas?
I'll give you a very brief synopsis. A Streetcar Named Desire is the story of a Mississippi woman in the late 1940s who tries to escape her past by traveling to New Orleans to live with her sister and brother-in-law in the French Quarter. This woman has expectations about culture and behavior and status that amount to snobbery, especially in the eyes of her working class Army veteran brother-in-law, whom she antagonizes by trying to get her sister to leave him. This prompts the brother-in-law to plot the expulsion of the sister, and the conflict between the two escalates, and in the end, of course, only one of them can be successful.
That's a fantastic synopsis, and it doesn't give anything away either. The title of the play has to be one of the greatest titles in all of literature. Can you tell us a bit about where it comes from? Because I don't think it was Williams' original working title, was it?
No, it wasn't the initial title. I believe the first idea for this play happened to come with a title in his mind as sort of a caption for the image. And it was called Blanche's Chair in the Moon. And the image was of a woman sitting at a window, looking up at the moon, waiting for a man who was never going to arrive.
Yep.
And then he wrote many, many drafts of it. He tended to write a lot of drafts and thresh out his ideas through the drafts. And when you follow the draft titles, you can get a sense of who may have been more of the protagonist in one case or another, indicated by the title. There was a one-act version called Interior Panic. That's Interior, Panic. Other titles, The Passion of a Moth, Go, Said the Bird, The Moth, The Primary Colors, Electric Avenue, The Paper Lantern, and The Poker Night. The Poker Night, I think, was the title that was on the version that he gave to his agent to sell. And she said, "You've got to change the title. It sounds like a Western."
Well, it's interesting you said earlier about how different titles change the focus a little bit, or suggestion about what the focus of the play is, because The Poker Night would shift the focus more to Stanley and the men, clearly, than the women.
Absolutely, as would The Primary Colors, where the moth or the passion of a moth and the paper lantern perhaps put the focus on Blanche. And it's my understanding that striking that balance between those two main characters was important to Williams, and it was important to Kazan, the original director. And when you say this about the strength of the Blanche that Patsy Farron plays, they've got to be equally matched.
Yeah.
If you're worrying from the beginning that someone's going to be crushed, then what are you watching?
Yeah, for it to be a fight. So this final title is based on reality, isn't it? There is a streetcar in New Orleans named Desire.
There was. So yes, there was a real streetcar named Desire. There was also really one called Cemeteries. And then there is a neighborhood called Elysian Fields. And so, as usual with Williams, there's more metaphors than you can count.
Yeah.
This metaphor that's in some ways sums up the play, when Blanche says to Eunice at the beginning, "They told me to take a streetcar named Desire and then transfer to one called Cemeteries and ride 6 blocks and get off at Elysian Fields." It's practical, but that journey metaphorically is the one that Blanche takes.
Yeah. Fantastic. The Elysian Fields, in Greek mythology, the final resting place of the heroic and the virtuous. Whether Blanche is virtuous or heroic, but whatever, it's the end of the line for her, is the suggestion. And we'll talk about desire. There's quite a lot of desire in the play. It's often also said, Thomas, that much of Tennessee Williams' work comes from the emotional history of his own life. And there are definite autobiographic sources for some of the characters and themes that we see in Streetcar. Can you tell us some of those elements of his life that he drew on that appear in this play?
Absolutely. Well, yes. His first 3 major plays of the 1940s, The Glass Menagerie, Summer and Smoke, and A Streetcar Named Desire, one of the aspects that is reflected in the plays and that resonates in the plays, even though they're not what the plays are about per se, are the tragedy of his sister Rose. In her early 20s, began to exhibit strange behavior, particularly around issues regarding intimacy, sex, dating, those kinds of things. She was eventually diagnosed with dementia praecox in 1937, which would be essentially schizophrenia. But prior to that, she was hospitalized. She started being hospitalized for the first time in 1930. And it was heartbreaking to Williams because he and his sister had been very close. And in 1943, after his sister had been institutionalized for 6 years, he got a letter from his mother in which at one point she said, chattily, Rose's head operation went well. And apparently he called her and said, "What operation?" And the mother had approved one of the first prefrontal lobotomies in the country. And after that, his sister was childlike for the rest of her life. She never, of course, recovered from it. And he had a lot of feelings about that. So that's part of what you see going on in Streetcar as well as in Menagerie and Summer and Smoke.
It's impossible not to think of his sister when watching Blanche, particularly at the end of the play, where she is taken into institutional care and the fragility that she displays at various points is reflected. And possibly also about the character of Blanche and his mother. I mean, tell us a bit about his mother.
Well, by all accounts, she was an extremely verbal person. She talked all the time to the point of being neurotic. She was not from the South. Her parents were from Ohio, as she was, and her father, who was an Episcopalian minister, was transferred to a church in the South. And she assumed the airs of a kind of professional Southern belle. According to biographer John Lahr, she was frigid. She definitely had issues surrounding sex and intimacy. Mr. Williams was a drinker and a gambler. and kind of a rough person. Are we getting the picture here? So I think it resonates in there, but I don't think that's who Blanche is. I think what's resonating even more in Blanche is Rose's intense need for intimacy and her inability to function on a social level at that time and place with boys. You can also add into the mix that Williams, well, let's just say, probably because of the mother's influence, there was a lot of repression in the house when it came to sex. You know, the more something is repressed, the more likely it is to pop out in an uncomfortable way.
Yeah, I was going to say there's something of that clearly in Blanche's promiscuity and, of course, Tennessee Williams' own, I think, well-known promiscuity.
And he always talked about himself as coming from Puritan stock and being a Puritan. And he was conservative, but he also identified his entire life as a bohemian. And as far as him actually being promiscuous, I'm sure these things are 2 degrees, but I'm not really sold on that.
It's more, I was getting more at the psychological source for Blanche in a way, because I think Blanche seeks comfort or something in sex.
Well, she does.
To escape some unhappiness. And I think there's some correlation there with Williams himself.
The question about the relationship to sex and intimacy as reflected in the Williams family, as we see it in Blanche Dubois, is the whole question of being able to fully express oneself sexually and where it crosses the line into intimacy and love, and when is that acceptable and when is it not. And I think in the case of Stanley and Stella, Stella Blanche's sister, you have 2 people who love each other passionately and enjoy each other physically without shame and without fear. In Blanche, she has all these complex feelings about intimacy and sex. And one of the questions you can always ask about Blanche is, why does she go to New Orleans? What is it she's escaping? And we know from the text she's escaping because she was fired from her job. And why was she fired from her job? Because she was caught seducing a 15-year-old boy, a student. What had happened before that? She had lost the family plantation, Belle Rive, and she just kept sinking further and further and further.
Stanley discovers that she ended up living in the hotel there, and it didn't sound like she was far from living the life of a prostitute and got thrown out of the hotel.
I don't think that's evidenced in the text, but people have assumed that from the beginning. I think part of that is that the idea of a woman expressing interest in sex is fairly new in terms of that being acceptable. And in the 1940s, if a woman had a lot of sex, it couldn't be because she wanted to or she needed to. It must be because she's a prostitute. And I actually don't think that Blanche is. I think that she is expressing her grief through physical intimacy, and that's the only way she knows how to get it.
Yes, I agree with you in terms of that interpretation. We're going to change direction now a bit and ask you about the structure of the play. This play comprises 11 scenes. It's not entirely clear as we watch it how much time elapses over the course of the play, although in the text you will get some indications. But it feels pretty continuous and contained, of course, because it's all taking place within the one set of the apartment Stella and Stanley live in, or just the outside of the building there. So I was going to ask you, what holds the sequence of these 11 scenes together? What's going on that unites it?
I've never thought of it that way.
Oh, it's a good question then.
It's a great question. I think that you really stumped me.
Okay, I got one answer for you that might get you started. So one of the things I think that holds it together is this thread unfolding of the details of Blanche's past. It comes out gradually in sequence. Hints are given to us. And the action that results is as a result of some of the things that come out. The other thing is that it's essentially a battle between Stanley and Blanche, isn't it? And there's a sort of starting and an end point to that. That's your synopsis of the play beautifully encapsulated that. So there's a certain structural intent to that. We have an opening with her arrival and invading Stanley and Stella's space and threatening Stanley, and we have an ending where she leaves.
I agree with you that the story rolls out in a way that grabs the audience and keeps them watching. And one of the things is that the audience frequently knows more than all the characters know.
Exactly.
And so there's dramatic irony as they begin to discover things about Blanche's past, about Stanley, and they see what each other is up to, and that pulls you right through. As far as it being episodic in the scenes, that's something that Williams had become interested in the early 1940s. He and Arthur Miller studied at the New School in 1940 under a man named Erwin Piscator. There's no hard evidence of what he picked up from Piscator. One of the things people look to are the episodic nature of the plays. But the one thing that I get a sense is that Williams understood Piscator to be a polemic. He wanted all of his plays to have a very specific message, and he wanted to hit the audience over the head with it. And Williams eventually rejected that. And once his plays start becoming more complex, like Streetcar, it's hard with Streetcar to say who's a hero and who's a villain.
Absolutely.
And he doesn't tell you what to think at the end. He hands it to you, but there's a certain level of ambiguity. You don't really know what's going to happen to Blanche. And you really, even though you know Stella stays and you know Blanche leaves, other than that, you don't know. You don't know what's going to happen to Stanley and Stella.
Absolutely. And the play is so rich for that. This is a perfect segue to dive in more detail to talk about these larger-than-life characters. So let's start with Blanche, a fabulous role for an actor, because it is painfully obvious from the start that what we see on the surface of Blanche is not necessarily what's going on inside her. There's some sort of disguise of the turmoil she's in. And what she's doing a lot of the time is performing and holding the lid on the pressure cooker of the realities of her past and her circumstances. So that's great to watch the nuances of how that's played. What do we think also about, we talked about his mother's Southern pretensions, and Blanche has this in spades. She comes on with this fantastic performance of gentility and romantic ideas and all the rest. What do you think we make of her posing and pretensions? Are we sympathetic to her?
I don't think of all that as a pose that she's putting on. I think it's rather her acculturation. I think it's where she comes from. There are people who are understated everywhere, but there's a particular kind of Southern understatement that is a matter of courtesy that she uses, and I don't think that's a put on. She sees herself as coming from a place of gracious living. I think she clings to that because she cannot reconcile her behavior with her upbringing. She doth protest too much. She is trying to escape that past and that wild intimacy by getting a stable relationship with somebody like Mitch. And at the same time, she is a sexual being, and she recognizes Stanley as a sexual being. And I think that's part of the electricity that goes on from the beginning.
Yeah, but there is pretense because there's a big gap between the person she's presenting and the realities of her circumstance and her behavior.
But do people go around presenting who they really are? I don't think so. And again, this may be approaching it from the character's point of view, but I think that both Blanche and Stanley make sense to themselves. They're doing what they need to do to survive. And I think when you look at it that way, you can chalk the pretense up to her particular family, that location, Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s, whatever you want. Does she put on airs? Yes. We are fortunate to have a letter that Williams wrote to Elia Kazan. He says there are no, quote, good or, quote, bad people. Some are a little better or a little worse, but all are activated more by misunderstanding than malice. A blindness to what is going on in each other's hearts. Stanley sees Blanche not as a desperate driven creature backed into a last-ditch corner to make a last desperate stand, but as a calculating bitch with round heels. Mitch accepts first her own false projection of herself as a refined young virgin, saving herself for the one eventual mate, then jumps way over to Stanley's conception of her. Nobody sees anybody truly, but all through the flaws of their own ego. That is the way we see each other in life. Vanity, fear, desire, competition, all such distortions within our own egos condition our vision of those in relation to us.
Brilliant stuff.
You can pathologize all these characters, and people will do that now. So that's a play about domestic abuse and alcoholism and rape and insanity. Okay, that's one way to look at it. But you scratch the surface of anybody and you find there's more to them. So I don't find her pretensions all that different from pretensions we see in people all the time.
I don't disagree.
I think when plays like this are so well known, assumptions can be made about a character. And I think the whole business of Blanche is all about pretense. That's there. That's a component. But I don't think that drives the character. I think survival drives her. And if it's pretense that's required or humor or whatever, she'll do whatever's necessary to survive.
And you're right. It also comes from her cultural background. I think a lot of it, as you said at the beginning, is overshadowed to some degree by the film, because that drew some really stark contrasts with, I think there's a stage direction, in fact, that still exists at the very beginning that describes Blanche like a moth. So there's this fragility that he's suggesting potentially from the start, and that Vivien Leigh, as you said already, also had. And by contrast, we have Stanley presented, of course, as this animalistic.
Or antagonistic. And yes, eventually, of course, he is antagonistic. They both are toward one another, but it doesn't have to begin that way. I think a lot of it comes from these characters becoming kind of cultural icons because of the film. And that leads to stereotypes and assumptions. And what I always say is go back to the text. If you actually look at the text, he gives you a lot of the information. They say things, the characters say things that indicate what's going to happen. They have a self-awareness that's amazing. And all of this is layered with metaphors.
If we talk about Stanley and you're saying, look at the text, Stella herself describes him as a different species, and by which, of course, she meant the men that they used to go out with at home. But he is certainly a completely different species from Blanche in lots of ways. And Williams's original stage directions described him as a man who moves with extreme male assurance, strong, compactly built, eminently pleased with his own body, and this animal joy in his own being, implicit in all his movements and attitudes. The center of his life has been pleasure with women, with the power and pride of a richly feathered male bird among hens. He is contemptuous of weak men. He doesn't understand weakness. He's obviously presented as a powerful and determinedly unconstrained kind of character, but it's a fine line, isn't it, that's drawn, over which he can be dangerously uncontrolled and violent.
Well, as you were describing it, I was thinking, well, that's a healthy relationship to his body and to sex that he doesn't filter. But then the notion of manhood, masculinity, etc., particularly in that time and place, then can become a problem and is a problem. And one of the things that I always come back to is, remember, Stella and Blanche grew up in the same place. Stella knows all the things that Blanche knows about propriety and social graces and everything else, but she has embraced sensuality with Stanley.
Yeah. So that's one of the questions I have for you, of course, is that relationship. The Almeida production, again, makes it pretty clear that Stanley abuses Stella. And obviously in the play, this is explicit. He hits her and she runs up to the neighbors upstairs. Blanche helps her to go upstairs, but she comes back, as you described earlier, much to Blanche's horror. She comes back and they are reunited essentially in a sexual scene. This is clearly part of what they have together and why she does come back. But she has chosen that, hasn't she? Actively left where she came from and chosen him, and says, when Blanche says, you should leave him, she says, I'm not in anything I want to get out of.
It's interesting how we see things in a dramatic story, depending upon when it takes place and when it was written. But I think Streetcar falls into the camp of one of those plays that if we only look at it in contemporary terms, it's not going to make sense. I think that people understand those characters on a gut level. So what I would say is, no, it's not acceptable to beat your wife or hit her. But people choose all kinds of things in their lives with people that the rest of us wouldn't. The notion that, again, that a woman is choosing it for sex is radical. That she is a sexual being and that she is enjoying her sexual expression So I would say it depends on how you play it, how you see it, but it is an extreme form of makeup sex that happens in the play. They fight and then they make up. And they've showed us this is a pattern. They've accepted it in one another. Whether or not he'll change when there's a baby in the house, we have no idea. But I think that also then brings you to Stella's decision at the end. She is from the start of this play between a rock and a hard place.
Yes, well, let's not jump to the end quite yet, Thomas. But yes, in modern terms, the world is littered with women who stay with abusive men. But it isn't just that in this case. They love each other, and there's a healthy sexual relationship going on there. And as I said, she's not in anything she wants to get out of. It's very frank about this sexual attraction in the play. She says when she's explaining herself to Blanche about why she's not leaving, she says things happen between a man and a woman in the dark that sort of make everything else seem unimportant. And you mentioned about the morning after the fight and the makeup sex, she's post-coital. There's a fantastic stage direction that Williams has, and he describes her as she's in a state of narcotized tranquility.
Well, I think that's his sort of, well, he obviously has a way with words, but I also think that's sort of a polite Southerner way of saying that.
Yeah, it is, definitely. And then, of course, Stanley knows that's the power he has as well. When they have an argument about his being common, Blanche has called him common, and he thinks that Stella thinks he's common too from where she came from, as you described. And he says, yeah, you're right. I was as common as dirt. You showed me the snapshot of that place with the columns, their estate home. I pulled you down off them columns, and how you loved it, having them colored lights going. Yeah, the colored lights is one of the things they have together.
Another lovely metaphor. It's kind of wonderful that he didn't get explicit with it. One thing I'd like to say about that, when you mentioned the Almeida production, is my understanding is that one of Rebecca Frecknall's ideas for this production of Streetcar was to cast the actors as the same age as the characters. For some reason with Williams, they've just gotten older and older and older over the decades. So you get Blanche's in their 40s, 50s, and I've even seen some in their 60s. Blanche is 30 and the others are younger. And that's part of the sexual energy.
That's absolutely right. And that again is overlaid partly by the film, I guess, by Vivien Leigh. I don't know what age she was, but I don't think she was 30.
Or she wasn't dressed like she was 30. They put her in that blonde wig and she looked pretty rough.
So actually, I was slightly surprised when I came back to the play that she is only 30 and that there's still her whole life in front of her, and that the opportunities for, say, getting together with Mitch are real.
It's funny because it's period play, but it's not dated. However, one needs to know that at that time and in that place, for Blanche, she was an old maid. Got a reputation, your life was over. So she's trying to reverse that reputation.
Yeah, that's true. So let's talk some more about sex. We touched on it earlier about what Blanche's attitude to it is, and she has this awful conflict in her, doesn't she, about sex?
Yeah.
She talks about it as being bestial, but she's also traded on her looks and admits to intimacies with strangers, and she's ridden the streetcar named Desire herself. So she is conflicted. She feels shame. And a lot of this comes, doesn't it, from the failure of her relationship with her husband. We haven't talked about that yet.
That's part of what I was starting to get at when I said, well, why does she leave Mississippi? What's going on there?
Can you remind us what the background of that is?
In scene 6, when Mitch and Blanche come back from the date, and she tells the story of her young husband. And she says, he was a boy, just a boy, when I was a very young girl. When I was 16, I made the discovery love. All at once and much, much too completely. It was like you suddenly turned a blinding light on something that had always been half in shadow. That's how it struck the world for me. But I was unlucky, deluded. There was something different about the boy, a nervousness, a softness and tenderness, which wasn't like a man's, although he wasn't the least bit effeminate looking. Still, that thing was there. Well, that thing that she couldn't name surfaced when she opened the door to her room she thought was empty and saw the boy with an older man. That's all they say. And then the three of them go out to a place called Moonlight Casino to go dancing. And at some point, the boy runs out, goes down to the edge of the lake, and shoots himself in the head. And she then tells Mitch on the dance floor, I couldn't stop myself. I said, I know, I saw, and you disgust me. And so why did she leave Mississippi? I would say it would not be unreasonable to say that because she murdered her husband. And the grief and the guilt she feels over that, the only way she was able to work it out there was in physical intimacy, which is not unheard of. That's absolutely common. And this is also one of these things where Williams gives you the whole story. Later in the play, when Mitch comes back after he finds out the story from Stanley about where she lived in Laurel and the Hotel Flamingo, and he says, I want what you haven't been giving me all summer. In one of the speeches, she says, some things are not forgivable. Deliberate cruelty is not forgivable. Well, if you look at what she did to her husband, then she cannot forgive herself.
Ah, that's right.
She was deliberately cruel. But I think that underlies a lot of her behavior.
Yeah, and of course she says explicitly that after the death of Alan, her husband, intimacies with strangers was all I seemed able to fill my empty heart with. If you think about the failure, she is deeply in love, and you think about the failure they will have had sexually together. She has not been able to satisfy her young husband. She must doubt her own sexual attraction,
right,
and therefore wants to be loved in that way and wants to believe she can love in that way.
And she's vain. We know that from the text. She's vain. She pretends that Stella's her older sister. She has a lot of vanity. She doesn't want to ever be seen during the day with Mitch.
You were quoting Williams earlier. There was a similar quote where he says about Blanche that Stanley can only see the details of promiscuity in her behavior, not the underlying panic and need for protection, which had forced this upon her. So there are elements of that as well, that she's looking for sanctuary. It's interesting you mentioned she's concerned about her looks and also what you were saying earlier about their age, because even, I guess, at 30, she'd be worrying about that. And we think she's being trivial. However, it is her currency, and she's had to use it. And I think it's like genuinely moving speech she has, isn't there, where she talks about physical beauty passing, when she says, but beauty of the mind and richness of the spirit and tenderness of the heart, and I have all of those things, aren't taken away, but grow, increase with the years. How strange that I should be called a destitute woman when I have all of these treasures locked in my heart. It's poignantly convincing at that point.
It's one of the moments we get to see her struggling to overcome her behavior and her circumstances. You know, when I'm talking about all these things, I don't mean that saying that pretense is part of her acculturation and her personality. It doesn't relieve her, anybody in here, of their responsibilities. They make the choices themselves, and Stanley certainly does too.
Yeah, and actually, I think in that scene with Mitch, it's where she actually is genuinely honest, at her most honest and self-aware.
She is. There was a production at Circle in the Square with Blythe Danner. She did something amazing. During that scene with Mitch, where he comes to confront her, she had been playing a kind of refined Southern Belle-like woman. And when Mitch accused her with the information that Stanley had given him, he said, didn't you stay at a hotel called the Flamingo? And she said, Flamingo? And then he watched it drop. It was like she lost all of it. And she said, no, Tarantula was the name of it. I stayed at a hotel called the Tarantula Arms. And then she has a monologue that goes on for 2 long paragraphs. And as she was giving him the information about her actual life back then, she was just walking forward and she backed him up over a bed and had him in the corner against the wall. And she was a different person.
Yes, I was going to say, I think there's defiance in her as well.
Yes. And you see, that was a way of expressing that pretense as a survival technique. And then she was dropping it all.
Yes. I wanted to talk to you about the rape, what leads to this moment and the sexual tension between Blanche and Stanley, because the way she plays her responses to him. Does she bait him, do you think? Is her contrived kind of performance that she puts on, she's playing with fire, isn't she?
Yes, but I don't think she is in that scene.
No, I don't see that then, leading up to that.
But no, she says that from the first scene she has with Stanley when Stella goes out for a lemon Coke or something. She says to her, oh, I flirted with your husband. I did. I flirted with him like he was a little boy. And then in another conversation, something happens with Stanley, and she says, that man will be my destroyer. Oh, she recognizes a kindred soul in Stanley. The sexual charge between them, she must be aware of it because she's trying to suppress it. So does she, by provoking him, provoking violence? Because that's the tricky thing, is that rape is not about sex. It's about violence. It's about control. It's about power. It's a rape and it's sexual, but it's ultimately his control over her.
Correct. So she is playing with fire. She senses that. It's some of the cards that she's accustomed to playing, of course. And do you think some part of her seeks her own destruction?
Possibly.
Too far?
No, not that it's too far. I don't know. But yeah, she does show self-destructive behavior. One of the ways I think about that is just the past history we know about her. She's been trying to escape for a while. She loses Belle-Rive. She tries to escape the death of her husband. She escapes to New Orleans, and she tries to escape by having a respectable relationship with Mitch. And at the end of the play, if you're looking at it that way, she's a huge success because she finally does escape.
Yeah, not necessarily the way.
No, not necessarily the way we would think, but she does escape. She wants a cleft in the rock of the world that I can hide in. Well, a quiet sanitarium might be the place.
That's true. And she had hoped that Mitch might be that. And we'll talk about Mitch in a minute. But I would go back to this. I think it's way too strong to talk about it as a death wish. But there are all sorts of references to death that she mainly makes through the play. You know, the death of Alan to start with her husband, but she talks a lot about other deaths in her family that took place in the house in quite graphic terms. She dreams towards the end of dying at sea. There's a Mexican flower seller who goes by the front door that sends her into this speech about death. So I don't know. I mean, it's too much, I guess, to associate this self-destruction.
I don't think it's too much at all. And I think obviously death is a constant image in the play deliberately. And it's in that first metaphor. I took a streetcar named Desire and transferred to one called Cemeteries. Desire led to death. I think also, isn't this a long-standing trope in literature? The French word for orgasm is le petit mort. And even the image of a moth to a flame, where they become one and the moth is extinguished.
You're right about the rape being about control, however. And one of the things I noticed in rereading the text in that scene, and I emphasize, I go back to saying she was not asking for it in that scene, anything but she was aware, her fear was there. She saw what might happen before he did.
And it was the first time she was alone with them where Stella wasn't nearby. So she knew immediately there could be danger.
I mean, at the very time his wife is in the hospital to give birth to his baby. It's pretty vile behavior, of course. I don't think he had the idea until he sees her fear.
That's what it seems to be from the text. I think he's thought about her sexually from the beginning, but the opportunity becomes clear because he sees her back away from him.
Yes. It's an electrifying, horrible scene as well about power, isn't it? It is the only way that he can bring her down off her perch. So it is about control.
Yeah. To me, it's wonderful that it's not seen. You know, we get it. It's sufficient the way it is.
I believe if you look at the text carefully, there is a certain resignation on her part that physically she gives up enough that he carries her to the bed. And I think that it prefigures her resignation at the end of the play as well. I want to divert for a second, Thomas, to Mitch, because we haven't given him much time. Whether he deserves much time is a question, because he seems somewhat insipid and peripheral next to the fireworks of these main characters. But it is important to what happens to Blanche and represents, of course, a stark contrast to Stanley and potentially, as we said earlier, sanctuary or a way out for Blanche. But it's obvious that this relationship, Blanche, is doomed to fail, isn't it? Or is also that wonderful moments where we wonder, is this possible? Is this really possible?
I don't think it's doomed. I think it's only doomed because Stanley's going to destroy it, because he wants to destroy her. But if Stanley wasn't interfering, I think they would have gotten there.
But it's dramatic irony. It's very hard to watch because Mitch does not know what Blanche really is. And also we essentially interpret that it's a step down for her brilliance next to his mediocrity, and that she's basically willing to compromise. And is that a proper basis for them having a lasting relationship? The wool is going to be pulled off of his eyes at some point.
Well, it may or may not be. I look at it a little differently.
Okay.
Mitch is important for a number of reasons and not just the plot point. He's not like any of the three of them. He is a modest and decent person.
Yep.
And he's a gentle person. And that is part of her attraction to him. And I think she really is attracted to him in that way. That's what she's craving, but she's torn because she wants, she's experienced the excitement of somebody like Stanley. But what does she want? She wants a cleft in the rock of the world. She wants that gentle person.
Yeah, he's an antidote to Stanley, no question. He's a more civilized.
Also an antidote to her past. I think she's playing it a little too far. We know she needs to turn it around pretty soon. And then would he ever find out? I don't know. Maybe he'd find out she's straight in the sack. No, she set her, and he gives it to you. It's in the poker night. She flirts with him outside the bathroom door, and then she goes over to her sister and says, that one's different. She picked him out. That's somebody who's not overly assertive, who's gentle, who she could work things out with.
It's heartbreaking to watch then when he knows what's happened and comes back and confronts her. His cruelty to her is hard to watch, but he's wounded. He wants to get away from his mother, have some life, and his hopes are dashed. So he's in pain.
Right. From his point of view, that's where people often say, well, Blanche is a liar. Well, she is a liar. She's also a fabulist and a romantic. And there are all kinds of reasons for the exaggerations or outright lies that she tells. But in that moment, based on what he's gotten from Stanley, he's been betrayed. She lied to him. If the audience does feel that they might be a success, then the end is that much more horrible because we've watched this missed opportunity.
Yeah, that's true. You talked about the style of the play because there are elements of it that strive to be more than naturalistic, I think, as in the earlier play, The Glass Menagerie in particular as well. And they are what I think Arthur Miller might be referring to when he talked about the beauty of the play. There's the language, which is lush and poetic at times, certainly from Blanche. That speech about her falling in love with her husband, for example, and the speech when she imagines dying at sea. There are a number of examples. But also I wanted to ask you about the very specific stage directions throughout. They are about lighting, sound, and music. That means that it's almost expressionistic in style at times, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about some of those elements and what he's trying to do with those?
I tend to agree with you. I think that that's what he was headed toward. People disagree on this very much. But in his production notes for The Glass Menagerie, he said something I'm going to quote here. Expressionism and all other unconventional techniques in drama have only one valid aim. And that is a closer approach to the truth. When a play employs unconventional techniques, it is not, or certainly shouldn't be, trying to escape its responsibility of dealing with reality or interpreting experience, but is actually or should be attempting to find a closer approach, a more penetrating and vivid expression of things as they are. I think what he means is the playwright's use of non-literary aspects, light, sound, imagery, to create meaning. So not all the meaning comes out of the words, obviously meaning comes out of action, but then that there's this other layer, which I think people think it's obvious, of course, because what play doesn't have lighting and sound and all these things? It's just a question of how they're used. He was of two minds about this. He always considered himself an experimental writer, and he also wanted to succeed. He wanted success very badly. And in the commercial theater, these things weren't done. So how these appear in Streetcar is interesting because Kazan helped him to keep some of these components. In a play in 1947, a commercial property on Broadway, you didn't have Blanche's inner thoughts heard by the audience, but you did have her fears projected onto the wall, right? These shadowy shapes. And they also used the jungle noises. And these are an extension of the street noises and the train coming straight at the window with bright headlights. Those are effects that Williams envisioned would give the audience feelings and understandings on a subconscious level as well as a conscious level and would create meanings.
I think what's most important about this is that it's an enhancement or gets closer to the truth. the psychological truths that are going on. So he's using lighting, sound. So he mentioned the train rattling past at moments when Stanley is at his most aggressive, and the music. So there are specific music themes, aren't there? And one of those is the polka that was playing when Alan, her husband, is on the dance floor at the casino and ends up shooting himself. And this polka recurs, and it turns out it's in Blanche's head.
But the audience hears it.
Yes.
Right. I recommend looking it up. It's the Varsuviana, and it couldn't be more innocent. It's just a little sweet polka waltz, very gentle.
But it stands for her being unable to rid herself of the memory of what that meant to her. It's a plague to her.
Yes, because the innocence was her husband, and it was interrupted by that gunshot. And that's what stops the sound for her.
The Almeida uses the drum set to create these sounds of threat, for example, at various times, but also the gunshot in particular at that scene where she's rehearing the music and the gunshot.
Right. And to me, that is following what Williams is inviting a director to do, to collaborate in terms of creating that mood and that meaning.
Yes, excellent. Okay, let's talk about the ending, Thomas. The stage direction for the final scene says that it's some weeks later, following the rape. Although in the audience, we don't know exactly how much time has gone by, of course. Stella is packing Blanche's trunk. She's leaving to go somewhere. We pretty quickly get an idea from Stella and Eunice, the neighbors' whispered exchanges, that Blanche has not been well and that they have made arrangements for her to rest in the country. At this point, what do we imagine has happened in the aftermath of the scene with Stanley that has precipitated whatever is now going on?
I think the audiences offer that information fairly quickly. Eunice says something encouraging Stella that she's doing the right thing, and Stella says, I couldn't go on living with him if I believed it. So we know that Blanche has told them that she was raped, and they've chosen not to believe her, and they're going to send her away. And we don't know where they're sending her away, but her behavior is definitely stranger than usual.
Yes. And what's very hard to watch is that, again, there's dramatic irony going on, isn't there? Because we know that they have a plan for her that she's not aware of.
Yes.
Also, where she comes to the realization of what is happening. So, spoilers here, a doctor and a matron arrive to take her away, and she realizes that something's going on. And her reaction of terror, which she tries to evade them and is physically trapped, is very hard to watch, isn't it? It's such a powerful scene.
Yes. And then also the expressionistic elements come back into play.
Yes.
He talks about the voice of the matron being as flat and emotionless as a car horn. There's an eerie, otherworldly quality to the way the matron and the doctor speak. And then when she sees them and rushes out and says she forgot something, lurid reflections appear on the walls in odd, sinuous shapes. The Varsuviana is filtered into a weird distortion, accompanied by the cries and noises of the jungle.
Aren't there some echoes as well?
She's greeted by echoes and re-echoes of mysterious voices. So then when that toneless voice says things to her, they're echoed throughout.
So they're, in a sense, representing the turmoil in her head, aren't they?
And her terror. And then when the smart doctor decides to be a gentleman and offer her his arm, and she takes it, the noises and the sinuous images disappear because someone is treating her with gentility and kindness.
Yes, and it's terrible also to watch her resignation at that point. She's taken away in an almost trance-like state, no fight left in her.
Again, it depends on the director, because that could be interpreted so many ways.
That's true, but she seems to be letting go of the fight, doesn't she?
Yes, she is, or she's embracing something else. Who knows?
Okay, what about Stella's position? We touched on this earlier, and how there's, the fight between Stanley and Blanche over Stella, and why does Stella stay?
Right.
But at this point, she's chosen Stanley above her sister. Interestingly, the film changed the ending. The film says Stella walks out.
Well, she grabs the baby and says, I'm coming upstairs with you, Eunice, and I'm never going back down. Never, ever, ever, ever. And she's running up the stairs with the baby. indicating that she's rejecting Stanley. So there's a moral choice being made, which is the opposite of Williams. He's leaving it rather open-ended to an extent. I know I've read a lot of directions, but I'd love to just read the final couple because I think they're the clue to all of this.
Yeah, okay. I was going to ask you about this final couple. I'm going to prompt you for this then. How do we interpret the final tableau image in the play of Stanley kneeling beside Stella with the baby, a very much an unholy family, it struck me, that the family will remain intact, ? But there's also a very interesting detail in the stage directions.
Yes, I would like to read those. Well, I mentioned I've seen this play done many times, and rarely does anybody follow these stage directions to the letter. A playwright's last line of defense are the lines, and then the stage directions, people choose or don't choose to pay attention to them. But there's a lot of information in these. Blanche says, "Whoever you are, I've always depended upon the kindness of strangers," and walks out. Stella cries her sister's name, and Blanche walks away without turning and goes around the corner of the building. Eunice descends to Stella and places the child in her arms. It is wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Stella accepts the child sobbingly. Eunice continues downstairs and enters the kitchen where the men, except for Stanley, are returning silently to their places about the table. Stanley has gone out on the porch and stands at the foot of the steps looking at Stella. He says a bit uncertainly, "Stella?" She sobs with inhuman abandon. There is something luxurious in her complete surrender to crying now that her sister is gone. Stanley, saying voluptuously and soothingly, "Now, honey, now, love, now, love." He kneels beside her and his fingers find the opening of her blouse. Now, love, now, love. The luxurious sobbing, the sensual murmur fade away under the swelling music of the blue piano and the muted trumpet. And then Steve in the kitchen says, "This game is 7-card stud," and it's the curtain. So the question is, we know what Stella's choice was. How does she feel about it? She's certainly crying because something horrible has happened to her sister that she's responsible for. She may well be crying at the relief she feels to have one of those two people out of the house. The way he describes that crying with abandon, Stella has not gotten into it for this entire play. She has played her cards close to her vest and has not gotten into it with either one of them. And now it's this huge relief. She's sobbing. Is it because she saves her marriage? Or is it because she's going to have to live with a man who hits her? And I've had many people tell me with certainty that it's one or the other, but I'm not convinced. I think it really depends on how you interpret it or whether you allow for the ambiguity. Again, when you talk about the sensuality and the physicality as a means of communication between Stella and Stanley, it's part of the reason why his hand goes to her blouse.
Yes. So I was going to ask you about that he kneels beside her and his fingers find the opening of her blouse. It's not just about the baby and the family. He's trying to reassert his sensual control.
I think it's a clue. And that's the thing about this, is if you don't do what the playwright's asking, the least I would suggest is to read that carefully and see what it is he means for you to understand.
Leaving it open-ended is the most powerful way to conclude the play. We don't know what Stella and Stanley's relationship will be, although she has ostensibly chosen to stay and their lives will continue. And in fact, the poker game recommencing, the original order is restored, isn't it? Stanley's won at the game if the poker game just carries on.
Yes, and it's as Eunice said, life goes on. So you do know that. Life will continue, but that's about it.
Listen, Thomas, we've gone way over time, but before I let you go, there is a tradition in the podcast where I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we could cover in the podcast, or one that's just a personal favorite, because I love to know about new plays. So have you got a personal favorite you could recommend to our listeners?
That is such an impossible question.
I know.
So I looked to see what other people said. We're mostly contemporary, and I thought, well, that's good. It narrows it down. So I'll narrow it down to very contemporary. I would suggest Clyde's by Lynn Nottage.
Ooh, I don't know this play. This is great.
It's the name Clyde Possessive is the title. And I saw somebody recommended two. And if I had to recommend two, I'd recommend Downstate by Bruce Norris. Both of them because they are so complex and they're really difficult subjects.
So what is Clyde's about?
Clyde's takes place in a short order kitchen of a diner near Reading, Pennsylvania, and there are 4 ex-cons who are working in this kitchen. And you, of course, find their stories run through the whole thing. But the thing that threads through the whole piece is that they have found self-expression in the sandwiches that they create. And the sandwiches became very famous. And Downstate.
So Downstate's also ex-cons, isn't it?
No, it's a home for convicted sex offenders who have molested children. And the plot is a man who was molested as a child goes to confront one of them. And somehow, in telling this story, he manages all of them to be sympathetic at some point. And that was just like, how did he do that? I thought that was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an extraordinary piece. Great suggestions. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for your time today. It was lovely to meet you.
Absolutely.
As the curtain falls on the shaken family and the card game continuing, what do we take away from this turbulent and tragic story? A fragile woman has been broken by the brutal realities of a modern world that no longer credits the pretensions of her past, and by the selfish power of a man asserting his assumed rights that appear to have consolidated control. Williams himself once wrote a Streetcar, "I don't want to focus guilt or blame on any one character, but to have it a tragedy of misunderstanding and insensitivity to others. Misunderstanding certainly comes from failing to acknowledge the truth to oneself and to others, even if we can all be forgiven for wanting to also believe in magic or what ought to be true." Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the Play Review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theater going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.